Welcome to our webinar on the state of the industry for plant-based meat, eggs, and dairy. Before we dive in, I'll mention a couple items. First, we will be sending a copy of today's slides to all registered attendees, and we'll also send you a link to the recording on GFI's YouTube channel. Second, all speakers will be available to answer questions during the last 15 minutes of the webinar. You'll see a Q&A button on your screen. Feel free to submit questions at any time, and some questions may be answered directly in the Q&A box. I'm joined today by my colleagues Sharon Murray to discuss investments, Priya Panescu to discuss science and technology developments, and Laura Braden to discuss developments in government and regulation. We'll also be joined by GFI Director of Science and Technology, Liz Specht, in the Q&A, which will be moderated by our colleague Molly O'Donnell. For those not yet familiar with us, the Good Food Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit that is developing the roadmap for a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. We are 100% powered by philanthropy, and we have earned GuideStar's Platinum Seal of Transparency, which is an honor obtained by fewer than 1% of nonprofits. GFI has more than 100 team members around the globe. We have 3 key areas of focus. Our science and technology team works to advance foundational open access research in alternative proteins and create a thriving research and training ecosystem around these game-changing fields. Our corporate engagement team partners with companies and investors across the globe to drive investment, accelerate innovation, and scale the supply chain all much faster than market forces alone would allow. And our policy team advocates for fair policy and public research funding for alternative proteins. The key question we're working to address is how we will feed 10 billion people by 2050 and do so sustainably, efficiently, and safely. Industrial animal agriculture is in the top 2 to 3 most significant contributors to the world's most pressing environmental issues. It uses 75% of agricultural land, yet provides only 33% of the global protein supply. It's also the #1 user of medically important antibiotics. So we believe an answer to these many issues is to make the meat, eggs, and dairy that people love in a more sustainable and efficient way. With alternative proteins, we can make proteins directly from plants with fermentation technology or by using animal cell culture. And as we know, plant-based meat includes products that biomimic meat using plants as building blocks. These products look, taste, and cook like conventional meat. Fermentation is increasingly being used as an enabling technology for the industry. It allows for the production of standalone protein sources or functional ingredients. And then cultivated meat is identical to animal meat at the cell level. It provides the same sensory and nutritional profile as conventional meat because it comprises the same cell types and 3D structure as meat from an animal. We'll be focusing on plant-based for today's presentation, but it is worth noting that fermentation and cultivated meat have both seen a lot of notable activity in the last year, including the first commercial launch of cultivated meat in December in Singapore. The content of today's webinar is based on GFI's 2020 State of the Industry reports. We welcome you to download these reports at gfi.org/industry, and they are chock full of detailed information about each sector within alternative proteins, so I hope you will take a read. Let's kick it off with an overview of the commercial landscape. This slide depicts alphabetized lists of the top 10 brands in the plant-based meat and plant-based dairy categories by US retail sales. The top brands in plant-based meat barely changed from 2019 to 2020, with 9 of 10 brands maintaining their 2019 status, the notable new addition being Impossible Foods. Some highlights from these retail brands include Field Roast, which introduced its first plant-based chicken nugget, Beyond Meat entering the frozen breakfast category with its sausage patties, Impossible Foods expanding its retail presence, reaching 2,700 US stores in May. Impossible's products also became available for purchase outside the United States for the first time with a retail launch in Hong Kong. Oatly expanded into Singapore with the launch of its oat milk in grocery stores, while Chile-based Natco introduced its line of plant-based milk products in the US market. And Califia Farms introduced Protein Oat, which is a plant-based milk with all 9 essential amino acids. This visual gives a sense as to how the competitive landscape has really evolved in recent years, from a core group of veggie brands to larger CPG companies, and also, of course, leading meat companies. Some examples of meat companies increasing their involvement include Cargill, manufacturing private label plant-based meat products for sale in retail and food service outlets. Planterra Foods, a subsidiary of Brazil-based JBS, the world's largest meat company, launched its Ozo brand of plant-based meat products. Brazilian meat company Marfrig launched a joint venture with global ingredients company ADM called Plant Plus Foods to sell plant-based foods across North and South America. And Tyson announced in December plans to reformulate its raised and rooted products to be 100% plant-based. And this decision from Tyson is a strong indicator that products containing animal-based ingredients do not necessarily meet consumer expectations for the plant-based category. In addition to the large brands, many early stage companies also made advancements in 2020. In plant-based meat, we saw Spanish company Eura launch a 2.0 version of its plant-based burger with reduced saturated fat. Notco introduced its Not Burger in Brazilian supermarkets. And one trend we saw in 2020 was disruptions in animal-based supply chains, including conventional pork in China, which led to price increases and lower access. And we saw the capacity of plant-based proteins to provide people a dependable center-of-plate protein option during the pandemic. We saw this with Hong Kong-based Omnipork, which released plant-based pork products in over 200 retail locations across China. Meanwhile, plant-based seafood company Good Catch debuted plant-based crab cakes, and fish burgers in the frozen sections of US grocery stores. Rebellious Foods released plant-based chicken nuggets in retail stores, and Simulate, formerly Nugs, launched plant-based chicken patties. In plant-based dairy, we saw Ripple increase distribution of its pea-based milk to Costco stores in the US. Notco introduced its line of plant-based milk products to the US market, and Kite Hill launched plant-based sour cream and coconut-based yogurt. In plant-based eggs, Singapore-based Float Foods debuted Only Egg, which replicates both the yolk and the egg white components of animal-based egg. The product is expected to launch commercially in 2022. British brand Cracked released a liquid egg product in the UK. And this is just a sampling, so for a more comprehensive list of product launches, please refer to the commercial landscape section in the State of the Industry report. We also saw expansions in private label or store brand platforms in retail. So US retailer Kroger expanded its Simple Truth platform with more than 50 new plant-based products, including beef and chicken. UK retailer Tesco committed to a 300% increase in sales of plant-based meat products by 2025. 7-Eleven launched plant-based meals featuring Omnipork in 800 stores across Hong Kong. Japanese retailer Muji added ready-to-eat plant-based meat products, and Muji merchandises a variety of products ranging from stationery and clothes to furniture and beauty products. So the addition of plant-based meat to their assortment illustrates how even retailers not focused on food are capitalizing on the alternative protein opportunity. Plant-based activity continued in food service despite the disruption in the food service channel caused by indoor dining restrictions due to COVID. In 2020, we saw Wawa's addition of multiple plant-based breakfast items, Einstein Brothers Bagels' trial of a Beyond Sausage sandwich, Burger King US's addition of the Impossible Croissantwich, and Starbucks US's nationwide rollout of the Impossible Breakfast Sandwich. We saw launches in Mexican cuisine at On the Border and Del Taco, and expansions into pizza at Pizza Hut, Papa John's UK, Domino's India, and California Pizza Kitchen. We also saw international expansion in food service. So KFC debuted plant-based chicken nuggets from Cargill in China. KFC, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut offered plant-based meat from Beyond Meat. Chinese fast food chain Deco's added Starfield's plant-based chicken and actually swapped animal-based eggs for Eat Just's plant-based eggs in 7 menu items across 500 locations. Starfield also released ground meat items in hundreds of locations across China in partnership with 6 major chains. And Tyson announced that it would sell the Raised and Rooted line in European food service as well. So now that we've covered a sampling of developments in the commercial landscape, let's take a look at both US and global sales of plant-based foods in 2020. We'll start by reviewing plant-based food growth in the US. All of the US retail data on these next few slides was commissioned by GFI and the Plant-Based Foods Association from our data provider SPINS. Retail sales of plant-based foods grew at 27% over the course of 2020 to hit $7 billion. This is up from just under $5 billion in 2018. Looking at individual categories, we see that plant-based milk is the largest plant-based food category at $2.5 billion. And the next largest is the aggregation of all other plant-based dairy categories like plant-based ice cream, yogurt, and cheese. And these categories reached a combined total of $1.9 billion in 2020 and grew at 28%. Plant-based meat is the third largest category, and it grew at an impressive 45% over the course of the year and crossed that milestone billion-dollar mark to reach $1.4 billion in sales. One more category to highlight here is plant-based eggs, the youngest and smallest category at 27 million. Plant-based eggs grew at a massive 168%. Growth is strong in all census regions, with the South actually edging out the West as the largest market. This strong demand in the South is likely being driven by urban areas, particularly large cities like Austin, Atlanta, DC, and Charlotte. We see the same dynamic for organic, non-GMO clean labels, in which the South is a close second to the West due to these highly populated, food-forward urban cities. One more data point to note here is that people of color over-index for plant-based purchasing, both buyers and dollar spend. So cities like Atlanta or cities in Texas with high percentages of people of color could be driving that dollar spend upwards. This slide is really illustrative. So here we compare the dollar sales growth of plant-based products to that of animal-based products across key categories over a 2-year time period. And across categories, plant-based product sales growth is significantly outpacing that of animal-based products, with most plant-based categories experiencing high double-digit sales growth over the past 2 years. And here we can see the share of the market that plant-based foods have in each product category. So plant-based milk has the largest market share at 15% of overall milk sales, and plant-based butter and creamer have a 6 to 7% share. Plant-based meat and cheese still only have a little more than 1% share of their respective categories. So across the board, we can see a ton of opportunity for share growth if these other categories can follow the trajectory set by plant-based milk. It's also helpful to look at how plant-based sales performed on a weekly basis during COVID. So this slide displays plant-based meat and animal-based meat sales growth during 2020 versus the same week in 2019. We can see that plant-based meat's sales growth consistently outperformed that of animal-based, with highs of 150% during pantry stocking, and then a double-digit growth through May as well. Let's take a look at plant-based milk specifically. So plant-based milk dollar sales growth did outperform animal-based milk, but not nearly to the same level as plant-based meat did. We can see here that growth rates versus the prior year were fairly close between plant-based and animal-based milk during March and April. And as the pandemic disrupted food service and retail distribution channels, many brands actually added to direct-to-consumer distribution, including Impossible Foods, Beyond Meat, and Alpha Foods launching their own DTC websites. Brands such as Exponential Foods and Australia-based Fable Food Company launched their DTC presence years ahead of schedule. So COVID may have brought about a long-term shift in consumer behavior and online grocery store sales beyond the plant-based food category. We can see in a Mercatus study here, a forecast that online grocery will make up about 12.5% of total grocery sales by the end of 2021, compared with only 5% if not for COVID-19. Mercatus also predicts that online grocery sales will hit nearly 22% of total grocery sales by 2025. And basically, this is all to say that plant-based brands have additional opportunities to fully leverage all channels to distribute their products, and online grocery will play an increasingly important role in distribution. Let's take a quick look at global sales of plant-based meat and milk. The global retail sales data on the following slides was commissioned from Euromonitor. Global plant-based meat sales crossed the $4 billion mark in 2020, growing at a rate of 24%. On a regional basis, Western Europe and North America are the largest markets for plant-based meat, although North America had much stronger growth at 40%, much of it driven by US sales. Plant-based meat markets in other regions around the world are in early stages and sales are in the low hundreds of millions. Asia Pacific will likely see increased growth over time as more companies begin expanding into the Chinese market. Taking a look at plant-based milk, we can see that 2020 global sales were just shy of $17 billion. And on a regional basis, Asia Pacific is the largest market for plant-based milk at more than $9 billion in sales. And the next largest market, North America, is only a third of the size, although it is also one of the fastest growing markets for the category. And I will note that Asia Pacific's large share of market makes sense given the long history and popularity of plant-based milks in that region. So where is the market headed? This slide displays both US and global market projections for plant-based meat from various sources. In the US, forecasts estimate that plant-based meat will be a $30 to $40 billion market in 10 years. And globally, UBS and JP Morgan forecast market sizes of $85 billion and $100 billion respectively by 2030. So we can say that the market is headed up. Next, we'll shift to a few insights on US consumer dynamics and research before we hand it over to Sharon to discuss investments. So who is the plant-based consumer? In the US, plant-based buyers tend to be younger, from higher income brackets, and have college or graduate degrees. They are also more likely to have children and to be people of color. While all people of color over-indexed for plant-based purchasing, Asian consumers in particular had high interaction. And these demographic trends hold in terms of dollar indexes as well, with consumers aged 35 to 44, consumers with graduate degrees, and consumers with incomes greater than 100,000, all having high levels of interaction. In addition to increasing retail sales, consumer trial of plant-based foods is increasing. A study by UBS found that the percent of consumers who have tried plant-based meat increased nearly 4 times, from 13% to 48% from Q3 2019 to Q3 2020. This is a massive growth in trial of plant-based meat over the course of just 1 year. Consumers indicate that health is the primary reason they eat or try plant-based foods, while environmental and animal welfare concerns are secondary. This finding is consistent across a wide number of studies from 2018 to 2020. Meanwhile, for those who are choosing to eat plant-based foods more often, health benefits are the main driver of increased consumption, but they have dropped in importance over the past 2 years, while environmental concerns have risen. So as time goes on and concerns around climate change continue to grow, the sustainability benefits of plant-based foods may become an increasingly important driver of consumption. While health and environmental concerns bring consumers into the plant-based food category, taste and price are key factors influencing trial or continued consumption. So perceived taste and price are among the top reasons consumers either do not eat or will not try plant-based foods. And this suggests that plant-based food companies should focus on creating high-fidelity plant-based products that closely mimic the sensory attributes of animal-based foods, as well as develop affordable products with lower prices. So reaching price parity with animal-based meat is an important step towards plant-based meat's widespread adoption, and it can help plant-based products earn a larger share of the total meat market. Several plant-based meat companies moved closer to price parity in 2020, including price cuts from Impossible Foods, value packs from Beyond Meat, and Before the Butcher's new mainstream patties, which rolled out very near price parity. And that about wraps up this section, and I'll now hand it over to Sharon Murray to discuss the 2020 investment landscape.
Thank you, Emma. It's so exciting to hear you go through that, even if I have seen some of those facts and figures before. So if we can move on to our investment section, thank you. So on this first slide, let's take a look at investments as a whole for alternative proteins in 2020. As you can all see, the capital flowing into alternative proteins as a whole, as well as more specifically into plant-based food companies, has been increasing rapidly. In 2020, we saw investments into plant-based companies total $2.1 billion, which is equal to nearly half of all time investments in the category. Investments in plant-based also surpassed investments in the fermentation and cultivated categories combined, though this can be largely attributed to the relative maturity of the plant-based category, which results in later stage and larger rounds. So on this next chart, we zero in on the plant-based annual figures. And I think it's quite a salient illustration of how these investments have truly skyrocketed. The $2.1 billion we saw invested in 2020 was 3 times more than investments in the prior year, demonstrating investors' growing confidence in the space. Next, we've included a chart here that summarizes the characteristics of plant-based fundraises in the past decade. We've included the median, the minimum, and maximum deal sizes, as well as deal counts. And for me, there are a few interesting takeaways here. First, the highest count of deals occurred in earlier rounds. Each of the angel, seed, and Series A deal types saw between 30 and 40 deals since 2010. But we're seeing the plant-based category mature with an increased number of later stage deals. So as you can see, there have been 18 Series B deals and a handful in each of Series C through H. It's also evident that debt is relatively underutilized. There have been only 14 debt deals over the past decade, coming in at a median of only 3 million. So this represents a gap that investors can look to fill in 2021 and beyond. Zooming in to take a look at the key funding rounds in 2020, we can see some heavy hitting rounds in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Impossible Foods raised $700 million across 2 rounds. And while this number alone is pretty impressive, it's even more so when you consider that this is more than was invested in the entire plant-based category in 2019. In addition, the Live Kindly Collective raised $335 million. Oatly raised $200 million in private equity, as well as $78 million in debt, which I'll say I hope wasn't all spent on that Super Bowl commercial, as enjoyable as it was. And then finally, Califia Farms raised $172 million. Turning to liquidity events, also known as exits, which represents the sale of an equity owner's interest in a company, typically in the form of a merger, an acquisition, a buyout, or an IPO. We see relatively light activity in 2020. There were only 9 disclosed deals, summing to a paltry $15 million in disclosed transactions across 2 of the deals. But while these numbers are low, they're not overly surprising or meaningful, as liquidity events are relatively infrequent, particularly early in an industry's development, and vary vastly in size, such that any single event can truly skew one year's numbers. In addition, many liquidity events are undisclosed, so that's likely an underestimation. This is also true for the investment figures shown earlier, but to a lesser extent. And while we're really encouraged to see this growth in investment, it is worthwhile to put it into perspective. So when we consider the drivers of global greenhouse gas emissions and the industries that can offer solutions, we see a pretty meaningful disconnect. According to the UN, raising livestock for food contributes to about 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which actually surpasses the 14% from the transportation sector. And yet we've only seen about $6 billion of private capital invested in alternative proteins, as compared to $50 billion in electric vehicles and charging technologies, which is more than 8 times the capital. In addition, while global greenhouse gas emissions from livestock are about 40% of those from traditional energy production, investments in alternative protein makes up only about 5% of the invested capital in renewable energy. And all of this is not even looking at public sector funding in this space or public markets, where the difference is even more stark. So all that is to say, more investment is needed, both from the private sector and from governments, to mitigate the environmental impact of conventional protein production, meet global climate goals, and sustainably feed a growing population. So now I will pass it on to Pri to discuss developments in science and technology.
Thank you so much, Sharon. That was so exciting to hear all about the investment. At a high level, plant-based meat formulation is focused on getting plant-based proteins to replicate the same texture and experience as animal-based proteins. Much of this relies on production method, but there are advancements that can be made in source raw materials and ingredients themselves. For example, crops have historically not been optimized for their protein content or the functionality required by many plant-based meat, egg, and dairy products. The plant-based ingredient industry has a need for crops that are bred to exhibit lower levels of metabolites and enzymes that negatively impact taste, as well as bred for higher protein content and functionality, like improved solubility, water binding capacity, and fat binding capacity, all of which contribute to desirable sensory attributes in plant-based end products. 2020 saw multiple developments in seed and crop optimization. Equinom closed a $10 million Series B funding round and opened a new R&D facility for seed breeding in Israel. Equinom uses a non-GMO seed breeding process to create golden trait seeds that are optimized for use in alternative protein products. Benson Hill, a seed breeding company that uses both traditional and GMO breeding methods, announced plans to release its ultra-high protein soybean varieties in the 2021 crop year. If successful, these varieties will be the first commercially available soybeans that could effectively replace soy protein concentrate made through standard soybean crushing and bypass traditional dry and wet fractionation steps. Yield 10 and Rothamsted Research announced a partnership aimed at commercializing a CRISPR-edited camelina plant capable of synthesizing the highly unsaturated omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA. An abundant source of low-cost, animal-free omega-3 fatty acids will be required for alternative proteins to mimic the nutrient profile of fatty fish like salmon and tuna. Proteins are often extracted to improve their properties for a set of applications. This usually focuses on removal of macromolecular components, including oil, starch, and fiber. Often this process also removes protein components, and the type of process will determine which components are retained and which ones are removed. The process can also intentionally or unintentionally alter the functional and nutrition properties of proteins in a variety of ways, including denaturation, hydrolysis, chemical modification, and cross-linking. Ingredient processing is almost always scale dependent, relying on high volumes to make up for low margins. Even as demand for new protein flours, isolates, and concentrates grows rapidly, the cost and complexity of building processing facilities can make ingredient production capacity slow to materialize. One of the highest priorities for alternative protein scaling is identifying new chemical, mechanical, and biological processing methods that offer high output quality and functionality benefits while being inexpensive, more efficient, and compatible with diverse crop inputs, as well as less scale dependent than current processes. 2020 brought developments from notable startups and ingredient processing companies. Canadian startup Burcon Nutriscience, which is commercializing a variety of plant protein crops and processing technologies, including for canola protein, secured a 95 million Canadian dollar debt financing package to complete its new protein production facility. Canadian ingredient giant Roquette opened the world's largest pea protein facility in Portage la Prairie, Manitoba at a cost of 600 million Canadian dollars. The plant is expected to reach full capacity in early 2022 and process more than 125,000 metric tons of yellow peas annually. Ingredion invested $185 million in plant protein R&D, completed a 100% acquisition of plant protein producer Verdient Foods, and opened a new pea protein processing plant in South Sioux City, Iowa. French agri-food company Avril and Netherlands-based ingredient supplier DSM announced a collaboration to produce plant protein, initially canola protein. Production is slated to begin in 2022. This table displays top plant-based meat brands in retail by the protein base they use in their products. We can see that brands use soy or wheat in their products, while several also use pea. It's important to note that a factor that leads to the use of these plant proteins is that soy, wheat, and peas are widely available as commodity pulses and grains. Companies are using plant proteins that they have left over from production for oils or animal feed. This isn't to say that soy, pea, or wheat are poor choices, but rather they're used because they're available. But there is potential for increased product functionality and performance from other plant protein sources if those can be produced at scale. This table displays examples of novel proteins that have the potential for use in plant-based product formulations. 2020 brought major developments from companies working to commercialize novel crops relevant to alternative proteins. Quinoa market leader, Northern Quinoa Production Corporation, formed a partnership with Ingredion to commercialize quinoa flours and concentrates. Puris, a Minnesota-based breeder and processor of non-GMO crops, such as yellow pea and soy, created a CPG product accelerator and launched a lupin flour. US-based startup Tervia, which is commercializing oil and protein from beans harvested from pongamia plants, or trees rather, established an organic and Fair for Life certified supply chain in India. Plantable Foods, which raised $4.6 million in April, articulated plans to release its lemna or duckweed protein commercially in 2021. An Israeli startup, InnovaPro, opened a US subsidiary, began recruiting a sales team, and closed several rounds of funding, including an $18 million Series B round to fund the company's commercialization of 70% protein chickpea concentrate. Crop development and ingredient optimization are topics worthy of their own webinar. As we can't go into more detail today, I encourage you to refer to GFI's Plant Protein Primer for more information on novel proteins and applications of these plant proteins. In addition to crop development and ingredient optimization, another area of focus for technological advancement is production method. Existing methods mainly involve mixing, molding, forming, and extrusion. The same key equipment manufacturers provide twin screw extruders for, both high moisture and low moisture extrusion. We've seen innovation in a few key categories as outlined here. Mechanical innovations such as 3D printing and shear cell technology, as well as biological innovation, including biofabrication and fermentation. For the purpose of this webinar, we'll focus on 3D printing and shear cell technology as they have been the most relevant applications to plant-based meat. The first technology is 3D printing. 3D printing can improve manufacturing precision and flexibility, enabling the fabrication of highly sophisticated products that mimic whole muscle meat cuts. Examples of companies exploring 3D printing in 2020 include students and researchers from the EU-led research project Training for CRM and University of Denmark developed a technique for 3D printing fish such as salmon and tuna. Through this project, they established the company Legendary Fish, now known as Revo Foods. 3D printing incumbent Nova Meat created more sophisticated versions of their products, including beef and pork steak and improved chicken and fish fillet products. Nova Meat's products currently cost around $1.50 for 50 grams, with the potential to drop significantly with further commercialization. Nova Meat's new pilot plant, slated to begin production in 2021, will feature a novel micro extrusion machine that produces 50 kilograms of plant-based meat every hour. Redefined Meat uses a 3D printing process with 3 separate tubes to manufacture its next generation plant-based beef, pork, and lamb steak to replicate the fat, blood, and muscle components known as alt fat, alt blood, and alt muscle, typically present in the conventional whole cut meats. This approach is enabled by the added flexibility of 3D printing compared with mold-based structuring or other more established industrial texturization processes. Redefined Meat unveiled 3D printed plant-based steak products in June. Another technology focused on solving the texture challenge is shear cell. Shear cell technology creates fibrous texture by applying shear force to plant proteins between 2 cylindrical rotating plates. The commercialization of shear cell technology has been spearheaded by the Plant Meat Matters Consortium at Wageningen University and Research in the Netherlands, with collaboration from strategic food industry players, Avril, Ingredion, Givaudan, The Vegetarian Butcher, and Unilever, among others. The only company currently deploying commercial shear cell technology is Rival Foods, which spun off of Wageningen University and Research in 2019. And Rival Foods recently entered into a partnership with the Live Kindly Collective to create plant-based chicken through shear cell technology. Ultimately, in the future, we won't see these 3 alternative protein production platforms as distinct industry segments, but rather as one large industry where we produce animal product alternatives across a spectrum using ingredients from 1 or more technology. Products from microbial fermentation are likely to play a role along the entire alternative protein spectrum, making them a critical component for the industry. Examples of companies releasing hybrid products in 2020 include JBS subsidiary Planterra Foods launched its Ozo brand of plant-based meat products, as Emma mentioned earlier. Ozo's products use fermentation company Myco Technologies' pea and rice protein blend, which is functionalized through fermentation using shiitake mycelia. UK-based Higher Steaks demonstrated a pork belly product made from 50% cultivated cells and a bacon product containing 70% cultivated meat. The remainder of the bacon product comprises of a mixture of plant-based proteins, fats, and starches. California-based cultivated meat company Mission Barns held public taste tests of a hybrid cultivated bacon product created through a combination of cultivated animal fat and plant-based proteins. And with that, I would love to pass on to Laura Braden to talk about government and regulation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pri. On the government and regulation side, in the US, we saw the US Food and Drug Administration reopen public comments on a rule it had originally proposed in 2005 relating to standards of identity. The proposed rule would create a set of general principles FDA would use when considering whether to establish, revise, or eliminate a food standard of identity. These standards of identity describe in detail what standardized food products, which for the FDA include milk and cream, cheese and cheese products, and mayonnaise, must contain, and how they must be proportioned, and sometimes how they must be manufactured. And standards of identity are seen by many as impeding the use of innovative ingredients in food production processes because they are inflexible and difficult to change. FDA said it reopened comments on the parts of the proposed rule under its jurisdiction because of changes that have occurred in manufacturing, food tech, market trends, and nutrition since 2005. 157 comments were submitted on the proposal, and GFI's comment argued primarily that FDA should clarify that non-standardized foods such as soy milk are able to use qualified standardized terms, in this case, milk, or terms that are similar to the name used for the standard, so long as the resulting name is non-misleading. In cases where standards do need to be revised, GFI supported FDA's proposed principle that revised food standards should permit maximum flexibility in the technology used to prepare the standardized food and should define ingredients as broadly and generically as possible, as long as the food's essential characteristics are not altered and its nutritional quality and safety are not adversely affected. As for what's next with this FDA rule, it's possible that FDA could decide to adopt the proposed rule and thereby establish a set of 13 principles it would have to consider in deciding whether to establish, revise, or eliminate standards of identity, or it could make changes to the principles based on feedback received, or it's possible that FDA will continue to take no action on the proposed rule. 2020 saw a slowdown in state legislative activity affecting the labeling of plant-based meat and dairy products by attempting to restrict or prohibit the use of meat and dairy terms on those products labels. This was probably attributable in part to a general slowdown in all legislative activity in the states that wasn't directly related to the pandemic, but it may also represent a lost momentum for state laws relating to plant-based meat and dairy labeling, as such laws have faced opposition in legislative chambers and legal challenges in court. Oklahoma and Georgia were the only states to pass laws affecting the labeling of plant-based meat products in 2020. Georgia's law was actually amended before passage to explicitly allow plant-based food labels to use meaty terms when the front of the package includes a prominent modifier such as vegetarian, veggie, vegan, or plant-based. Oklahoma's law, while also allowing the use of meaty terms on packaging when the packaging displays that the product is derived from plant-based sources, is more restrictive than Georgia's because it sets forth particular font size and prominence requirements for those modifiers. These requirements don't make a lot of sense or appear poised to alleviate consumer confusion, and Oklahoma's law has been challenged in federal court. On the dairy side, the only state law affecting the labeling of plant-based dairy products to be passed in 2020 was Virginia's law, and that law was vetoed by Governor Northam. Northam said that by eliminating the ability to label certain food products as milk, the law could hinder businesses' ability to thrive in Virginia. And he also said the bill likely conflicted with both the US and Virginia Constitution's protections of commercial speech. Litigation over label censorship for plant-based products yielded a variety of results last year. In California, a federal judge partially granted a motion for a preliminary injunction in favor of Miyoko's Kitchen, which sought to enjoin the California Department of Food and Agriculture from taking enforcement action against it, after the department sent a letter informing Miyoko's that its vegan butter label, along with some of its website content, violated state and federal law. While the court did not enjoin the state from regulating some of the terms on the label, including hormone-free and revolutionizing dairy with plants, it did preliminarily enjoin the state from regulating Miyoko's use of butter, lactose-free and cruelty-free. The court found that Miyoko's use of butter was likely not misleading, and that the state's restrictive view of how butter could be used in labeling was not supported by precedent or empirical research, noting that no evidence had been presented of anyone being tricked by Miyoko's product's vegan butter name. In Oklahoma, a federal court denied Upton Natural's motion for preliminary injunction of Oklahoma's label censorship law. The court found that the plant-based meat labels at issue could be misleading, and it considered whether the state's requirement of packaging for plant-based meat products comply with those specific font and type size requirements was unduly burdensome in view of the state's asserted interest in preventing consumer confusion. The court found that the requirements were not unduly burdensome, so it denied the motion for a preliminary injunction. That ruling, though, has been appealed to the 10th Circuit, and briefing in the appeal is scheduled to begin next month. Finally, on the litigation front in the US, in Louisiana, GFI, along with co-counsel at the Animal Legal Defense Fund, brought suit in Louisiana on behalf of Tofurky, seeking to invalidate the state's label censorship law that was passed in 2019 and went into effect in October 2020 on the basis that it unconstitutionally restricts free speech. That case has gone through discovery, but it has not yet reached the point of any court decisions being issued. The parties are expected to brief the First Amendment challenge in the coming week. And on the next slide, lastly, in October 2020, we saw the European Parliament reject a legislative proposal that would have banned the use of all conventional meat-related terms like veggie burger and plant-based steak on plant-based food labels across all 27 countries in the EU. In the same session, the European Parliament approved by a small margin proposed new restrictions on marketing plant-based dairy products by comparing them to conventional dairy products, which would have been, what could have imposed potentially quite broad restrictions. But just this week, though, we're happy to report that the European Parliament abandoned plans to introduce these restrictions, withdrew the proposals from EU negotiations over the Common Agricultural Policy, which is great news. Another interesting development was that the Irish Food Safety Agency concluded in 2020 that pea protein hydrosylate and soy protein hydrosylate do not fall into the novel food category, requiring regulatory approval. This was an acknowledgement that pea protein isolate's history of consumption had been established, and this conclusion may help set a precedent for the non-novel status of pea protein isolate in the EU, possibly easing the regulatory path there for products containing this ingredient. Now I'm going to hand it over to Molly, who's going to moderate our Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. That was a really exciting presentation, so much going on in the plant-based industry. So now I will be moderating the Q&A. As a reminder, please submit your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat. And we'll try to get to as many as we can in the last few minutes here. So first question is going to be for our folks from SciTech. Is shear cell technology a throughput enabler versus extrusion processing, or a product differentiating technology? Not sure what we can.
I'm happy to jump in on that one. Sorry, I'll get my video up in one moment. I think shear cell is certainly still in development for becoming a true high throughput commercial solution
one of the challenges with it right now is that it is currently a batch process. It's not to say that that's an unresolvable issue, but certainly from a throughput and scale perspective, continuous processing tends to win out in those cases. But I think there's certainly a need to look more broadly at new manufacturing technologies that can enable higher throughput speeds while also giving some of the benefits of shear cell technology, such as the kind of thicker tissues that are potentially possible and lower temperature and pressure requirements and so forth.
Great, thanks, Liz. So our next question looks like it'll be for Sharon. Is there any information on the investment comparison with different types of equipment and production technologies for plant-based meat, eggs, and dairy? And if not, if there may be any high-level trends or anything we could share.
Yeah, so I'm not certain if this question is asking about investments into companies that are B2B providers, right, specialize in equipment, or if this is more of a question on the company level, if they're focusing on meat versus dairy and eggs, if the costs are different. So I'll try to answer a little bit of both. So on the first, in terms of companies, we unfortunately don't have those numbers broken out. That's because one, it's kind of hard to categorize. So looking at one example, Rebellious Foods, they are creating equipment for creating plant-based chicken that is more efficient for this usage, but they're also creating plant-based chicken themselves. And these companies aren't particularly public on, how much of their funding they're earmarking for one business or the other. We did look at this in cultivated meat because there's a bit more distinction in the companies. And I'll say that it was a minority of the investments in cultivated meat. And I would imagine in plant-based, that's the case as well. That being said, some of the bottlenecks we're facing within plant-based today relate to scaling manufacturing, relate to this equipment, to the facilities in which this meat and other plant-based proteins can be developed. And so we are seeing investors starting to turn their attention in this direction. We're seeing some new plants, perhaps co-manufacturing facilities coming to market that can help address some of this bottleneck. On the other, in terms of the cost of the equipment, so I'm a little more familiar on the meat side, and certainly if any of my colleagues have more to add, please jump in. But my understanding is that the equipment on the meat side, because texture is so important, that's going to be more equipment and require more investment by the underlying companies.
Great, thank you, Sharon. So next question is on downstream processing for dairy and egg alternatives. I was wondering if you could, they asked to just share some information, maybe a quick primer on what that process looks like.
I'd be happy to speak on this a little bit. So generally for the raw ingredient processing, a lot of it might end up looking the same across dairy, egg, and meat analogs, isolating proteins versus oils or fibers. Once we get down to the end product, it's dairy and egg tend to be more of emulsified suspension type products, whereas the meat alternatives will be more solid and use extrusion technology. So those are some of the main differences of what ends up coming out from those products. And even though emulsion type technology might be used on those plant-based meats, in the end, again, they're using extrusion or other types of mechanical processes to make a nice solid homogeneous type of end product. Liz, I don't know if you wanted to add on a little bit to that.
Yeah, I think you hit all the main points there. I think the liquid nature of most egg and dairy products, even if they are thicker liquids, is just a different sort of processing machinery. But those raw ingredients processing, everything kind of upstream of ingredients being delivered to the end product manufacturer, in many cases looks similar, although certainly room for improvements to functionality that would really bolster specifically those properties like emulsification or gelling that tend to be pretty important in a lot of meat or egg and dairy products.
Thanks, Liz. So our next question is about fermentation. And if you caught our fermentation webinar on Tuesday, you'll know that fermentation-derived ingredients are really exciting for plant-based meat and have a lot of applications for improving the texture and the flavor. So someone asked what the most interesting fermentation-derived additives are, or if we have any examples of really exciting fermentation-derived ingredients with applications for plant-based meat.
I'm happy to jump in with a couple of maybe broad categories, but I think they demonstrate the versatility of fermentation as a solution provider for plant-based products. So the first category would be using fermentation to improve the functionality of plant proteins. So there are, companies like Ozo/Plantera that are using fermentation to improve both the flavor profile and the functionality of plant proteins before going into a plant-based meat product. Of course, fermentation can be used to produce purified enzymes that can help with functionality as well. So rather than using the whole organism, using enzymes to improve things like solubility, or enzymes to cross-link and improve the texture and the gelling capacity and so forth. And then, and I'll mention in that enzyme/whole cell category as well, you can use either enzymes or whole organisms to break down undesirable flavoring components from plant proteins, so that you don't have to do quite as much work to mask those or to remove those further in the processing or in the formulation. And then the other category is to kind of add to plant-based products. So that could be adding flavorings. Of course, the obvious Impossible Foods with their heme protein example comes to mind most readily, but there's a whole suite of proteins or other components, lipids, et cetera, that are doing a lot of the heavy lifting from a flavoring perspective, that there's potential to identify and produce those through fermentation. So yeah, I think that covers most of the categories. And then also potentially for nutritional value as well. A lot of vitamins are already made through microbial fermentation. So an opportunity to integrate that.
And I'll just quickly add that, like I touched upon in the presentation, what's really exciting about fermentation technology is Liz is clearly showing is that it's really available across the entire protein spectrum and the alternative protein space. So I think what's most exciting about it is how ubiquitous it can be and how versatile that technology can be within the plant-based space.
Yeah, definitely. So our next question is on the price of plant-based meat. And I know this is a highly complex question. I'm not sure we'll be able to give an exact answer, but someone asks, how far away do we think we are in terms of reaching price parity in plant-based compared to animal-based products?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on this one. So we do all know that to compete with conventional products, alternative proteins must achieve affordability that really unlocks the largest target market, which is omnivores. And plant-based options are currently priced at a significant premium across categories. And we do anticipate this gap shrinking as plant-based producers are increasingly scaling up production and seeking price parity with their conventional competitors. The most affordable fresh plant-based meat options right now are offered at prices that are roughly comparable to the more high-end organic grass-fed conventional ground beef, for example. And notably, some of the more affordable plant-based products are from private label brands as retailers sort of develop these store brands. And we have seen some existing momentum in approaching price parity. So at Dunkin' Donuts, the Beyond Meat sausage sandwich is sold at an equal price point to the conventional sausage sandwich. In early 2021, Impossible announced its second price reduction within a year for its plant-based grounds, which decreased the suggested retail price by 20%. And then Beyond Meat has also announced that it aims to underprice animal protein in at least one category by the end of 2023. And we just see so many aspects of the product costs having the potential to come down with scaling. So per unit costs can come down significantly for packaging, materials, like general and admin expenses, R&D, and channel costs as the sector scales up.
Awesome, thank you, Emma. Okay, next question will be for Laura here. We have a policy question. If you have any insights on the possibility that the Irish Food Agency statements you mentioned are likely to escalate to the European level.
I think that's a possibility, and so it's something to keep an eye on and watch closely. I can't say for sure whether that'll have an influence on how the EU and EU countries view those proteins, but it's an encouraging possibility.
Great. Next question here is on ingredients for dairy and egg products. I know we touched on mainly ingredients for plant-based meat, and I would definitely encourage everyone to check out the plant protein primer for more information on those plant protein sources, which will be sent after the webinar. But anything we could say on common ingredients for dairy and egg alternatives?
I will just add on the egg alternative side, I think this is one area where we're starting to see commercialization of algae-derived ingredients more frequently than in the plant-based meat realm. And a lot of that is coming from a need for binding functionality in egg alternatives. A lot of algae have polysaccharide kind of gelling type of properties that they're either secreting or within the cell. So I think that's a category where we see slightly some ingredient differentiation between egg and dairy with respect, or as opposed to plant-based meat.
Thanks, Liz. So next question here is on production equipment used to make plant-based products. So what types of production equipment are most common, and anything else you can say on maybe trends or places where we might want to find an alternative to certain types of equipment, anything you can say there.
Yeah, happy to hop in here. So, I think by far most plant-based meat products in terms of that end product manufacturing are using either low moisture or high moisture extrusion, as was discussed. The upstream ingredient processing is, there's a number of forms that equipment can take. Typically, it starts with a milling step, but then there are a number of routes for enrichment for the plant protein fraction. In some cases, there's just different means of kind of separating, and that can be done through a wet milling process or a dry milling process. So those have implications for cost of the facilities and so forth. And then once you've got sort of your texturized plant protein, a lot of the downstream steps to get from that as sort of a texturized input to your end product that has all of your flavorings and your marinade and colorings and all of that can actually look quite similar to meat processing equipment. So there's certainly case studies of meat processing plants that have converted over certain production lines or are able to retrofit and reuse existing equipment for those final end product stages.
Awesome. Thank you, Liz. So looks like we are right on the hour here, so we'll go ahead and wrap up. But thank you everyone for your attention and questions. And a big thank you again to all of our panelists for the presentation. So if you'd like to check out future events at GFI, please visit gfi.org/events. And we look forward to seeing you in a future webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.